Can I have everyone's attention, please? Could everyone please find a seat? We'll start the program momentarily. Thank you. Could everyone please find a seat? Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Library Hour. As you all know, the Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. We use the history, the spirit, the values of this wonderful, great patriotic institution, the Union League of Philadelphia, to create better informed, more engaged citizen leaders. And one of the ways we do that is through humanities-based programs like tonight's lecture, because we believe that knowledge itself, whether it's history or art or the Civil War or Constitution, is essential to being a good citizen. So thank you for being with us tonight. I always try to highlight one other program of the Legacy Foundation when we do programs like this, and it's going to be our exhibit. And we just opened our new exhibit which is right on point. It's Philadelphia, the Civil War, the Union League. And it's about the Union League's role in saving the Union. And so please come downstairs. We're open to the public now, Tuesdays, Thursdays, but of course, if you're in the house, we're open all day, basically from 8 a.m. till 5 or 6 p.m. So please come down and see this great exhibit. There's some artifacts that have never been displayed before, some really wonderful things. So please come and learn more about this important history. A few housekeeping items, if I may. One is, of course, please silence or turn off your cell phones, and I'll give you a moment to do that. Secondly, tonight's program, of course, is streamed, as all of our programs are, so we will have Q&A. Please use the microphone so that the people that are watching virtually can hear your question as well as the answer. And finally, I just want to thank all of you for your support, because this program, our civics education programs, our scholarship programs, the care of all this, the collections of this great league happens because of your support. And I thank you for all of you and your support. And if you haven't yet supported us, just look for me or Kristen Moran, who will explain to you how easy it is to be one of our many donors. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the historian, Jim Mundy of the Union League Legacy Foundation, who will introduce our program. Jim.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out. It's always nice when you can connect the dots of Philadelphia history to Union League history, and tonight's program does that especially because the Centennial was by and large organized by Union League members. It was run by Union League members. The official history was written by a Union League member. There were artists, Union League members, who were involved with the whole process, and so it's a really wonderful program to begin. And I think we're going to learn a lot of good stuff about Philadelphia and the Centennial altogether. So, and of course, my glasses just broke 5 minutes ago, so good timing. So let me introduce Dr. Orcutt. So Dr. Kimberly Orcutt is executive editor of 19th Century Art Worldwide. She has served as Andrew W. Mellon Curator of American Art at the Brooklyn Museum, Henry Luce Foundation Curator of American Art at the New York Historical Society, and Assistant Curator of American Art at Harvard Art Museums. She has organized exhibitions on American art topics from the 18th through the early 20th centuries, including the award-winning exhibit, The Armory Show at 100, Modern Art and Revolution, and that exhibit is still being talked about in art circles today. Her book, Power and Posterity, American Art at Philadelphia's 1876 Centennial Exhibition, was published by Pennsylvania State University Press. She is past chair of the Association of Historians of American Art, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Kimberly Orcutt.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the invitation and the warm welcome, and thank you all for being here. I must say, I feel like a bit of an interloper because I am not a Philadelphia historian, strictly speaking, but it's an honor to be here tonight to talk to you about one small but very important aspect of it. My caveat is that we'll be focusing in on one part of a huge subject in looking at the Centennial Exhibition. In 1876, one writer marveled at the fact that if each object across the fairgrounds were examined but 2 minutes, the entire exhibition would require a century. And a fictional character visiting the exhibition remarked that there was no use telling what I did see, but I could tell you what I didn't see in half a minute. So I'm going to talk about the fine arts display of the United States in particular, and how the foreign art displays interacted with it as well. And I will come to this from the perspective of a curator, and so we'll be looking not just at individual works of art, but also how exhibitions put artworks in dialogue with one another. Sometimes they play well together and sometimes they don't, and those dialogues send messages to viewers. In the case of this exhibition, millions of them. And this is a wonderful map of the fairgrounds, or rendering of the fairgrounds. So we're going to start by setting the stage. The International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products of the Soil and Mine, better known as the Centennial Exhibition, celebrated the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was the first World's Fair on American soil to reach a genuinely national and international audience, with 36 countries represented. Over 6 months, from May 10 to November 10, almost 10 million people attended the exhibition in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park, a number equaling nearly 1/4 of the United States population at the time. The Centennial Exhibition was perhaps the first event in United States history that represented a shared national experience demanding each citizen's participation. Every American had to decide whether he or she would travel to Philadelphia to honor the nation's birth and see the spectacle there. And hence the quote you saw on the first slide, there are two kinds of people in the United States, those who have been to the Centennial and those who haven't. The fairgrounds comprised 5 main buildings and several smaller ones, 17 state buildings, 9 foreign government buildings, and numerous restaurants and refreshment stands. The fine arts buildings that you see outlined in red there represented just a fraction of the total displays and square footage, but they marked a watershed that was recognized in its time as the most important exhibition in the United States up to that point. It remains the nation's first blockbuster show, and one of the largest, best attended, and most hotly contested of the 19th century. As the nation's first truly international exhibition of art, it attracted an audience of unimagined size and diversity. As a celebration of the nation's founding, the Centennial Exhibition represented a call not to merely bear witness to history, but to interpret it, recapitulate it, and to write it, begging the question of who would write that history and what it would say. The American Art Display in Fairmount Park came to represent the country's first official government-sanctioned reckoning of United States art. So this United States art exhibition provided not just an opportunity, but a mandate to create a canon of the country's art from the past century, along with a historical narrative that would join the past to the present and enshrine a national American school. And here you see from left to right, Thomas Moran, Mountain of the Holy Cross, Albert Bierstadt, California Spring, William Merritt Chase's Keying Up the Court Jester, which I hope you recognize from the wonderful Pennsylvania Academy walls, and Anna M. Lee's Patrician Mother. The great task of discerning and displaying a contemporary American school came at a time that the critic Clarence Cook called an era of revolution. The mid-1870s were marked by heated debates between two groups of artists and their advocates: the New York-based nativists of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, and you see a few examples of that on the left: Bierstadt Moran, Frederick Church, Asher B. Durand, Worthington Whitridge, and the cosmopolitan expatriates on the other side, advocated by younger artists, such as Chase and Lee, John Lafarge, Frederick Bridgman, Walter Sherlaw, and so on. And they encouraged work and study abroad, most often in Munich and Paris, taking the human figure as their principal subject. In addition to the growing antagonism between nativist and expatriate artists, exhibition organizers faced the task of melding their disparate civic identities into a comprehensive vision of American art. And their work was complicated by the United States' character as a nation of proudly distinct cities. And here you see just a lovely view of the main central gallery in Memorial Hall. Alongside this internal challenge, the Centennial Exhibition also presented an external challenge. The art exhibition in Memorial Hall and a nearby art annex would include fine art displays from the United States, Great Britain, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, Japan, Mexico, Australia, Brazil, and Russia, among others, that would be seen and compared side by side. The exhibition marked the first time that a large number of American works were displayed in the United States in a truly national and international context. The United States Art Department would showcase the country's artistic taste to both American and European audiences to face either their approbation or their scorn. So we're going to start by looking behind the scenes at how the United States Art Exhibition was organized. The job and the authority vested in it passed from hand to hand and finally fell to a small group of polemically opposed artists. They realized the importance of the fine arts display and that the artist represented there would be imprinted on the memories of millions of fairgoers and would enter a canon of the nation's cultural history. Those who were not risked being neglected or even forgotten by posterity. As the exhibition's significance became clear, two factions struggled to form an American school of art that would legitimize their work and determine whether the nation's cultural future would be shaped by national or international interests. And here you see Memorial Hall under construction. Centennial Exhibition organizers anticipated a fine arts display from the fair's inception. However, there is no record of any planning activity for the art exhibition itself until 1875. Instead, attention was focused, understandably, on a Memorial Hall, the facility that would house it. The Centennial Exhibition was the first international exposition to include a significant permanent structure dedicated exclusively to painting and sculpture. It was designed by Herman J. Schwartzman, the head of Fairmount Park's Department of Engineering. Ground was broken on July 4th, 1874, and work was finished at the late date of March 1, 1876, little more than 2 months before the exhibition's opening. From its early stages, Memorial Hall was more than just a display space. It was to become a national museum, and the Pennsylvania Museum was chartered in February of 1876. The art exhibition in Fairmount Park was widely expected to represent the entire country, but no state-sponsored national structure existed like the Royal Academy in England or the École des Beaux-Arts in France. While individual cities had established artist groups and coteries of cultural leaders, it was unclear who should take the lead for an event of national significance. Various official and unofficial groups attempted to make plans and facilitate arrangements, including artist organizations, established civic groups, state boards, and committees of artists and collectors. And after months of back and forth, exhibition officials appointed John Sartain, who you see here, chief for the Fine Arts Bureau in mid-September 1875, just 8 months before the exhibition opening, a horrifying prospect for a curator, I can tell you. Sartain brought considerable administrative experience and a wealth of contacts and energy to his new position. Sartain, as you may know, was a successful Philadelphia engraver and a remarkably active member of the art community. A prolific writer and publisher, he issued Sartain's Union magazine from 1849 to 1852. And Sartain was a complex and sometimes contradictory figure, by turns idealistic and pragmatic, a fervent supporter of progressive young artists, but not above extending special favors to his personal friends who were of a more conservative bent. Now, simply distributing information on the exhibition was an enormous task, but prominent artists gradually began to submit their applications, and on December 9th, 1875, Sartain affirmed that based on the submissions to date, the success of the American portion of the art department is assured. But it quickly became clear that Memorial Hall would not accommodate the number of works anticipated. Rather than decreasing the number of artworks exhibited, Sartain called for even more galleries. And in November 1875, his request to build an annex behind Memorial Hall was approved, and you see a drawing of it here. The art annex was a brick building hastily designed by Schwartzmann and destroyed after the exhibition. It was nearly as large as Memorial Hall, but instead of long corridors flanked by galleries, the annex was a beehive of 30 small square galleries, and it received fewer visitors and less attention, thereby privileging the works displayed in Memorial Hall. One of Sartain's major tasks was to facilitate the formation of a committee on selection made up of artists who would choose the works to be displayed, and a committee on arrangement made up of heads of leading arts institutions to oversee the hanging of the exhibition. And for the sake of the real Philadelphia history aficionados, I'm giving you their names. And the selection committee comprised 10 artist members, 5 from New York, 3 from Philadelphia, and 2 from Boston. And it is not surprising that the committee chose successful artists who were well known to them, rather than venturing to include younger or less commercially successful artists. As a result, the selection committee did not fully represent the American art scene in 1876, but rather comprised its established leadership, distinctly divided by city and by style. The New York contingent represented the nativist school that eschewed foreign influences and valued American themes, particularly Hudson River School landscapes. The other members were more open to internationalism. The Philadelphians on the committee had trained abroad and supported the work of their expatriate colleagues, and the Boston artists as well had a history of close ties to France. And here's Memorial Hall completed, and we'll fall back to that occasionally. But what about those American expatriates working abroad while the exhibition was being planned? Well, we don't have too many details, unfortunately. Before Sartain took office, government officials in Rome, Munich, and Paris were asked to appoint committees on selection for American art very late in the process, and no official representative was appointed to oversee submissions for American artists in London. Think Whistler, who could have exhibited here sooner if not for that. As a result, expatriate artists were at a distinct disadvantage to those residing in the United States. It seemed that their work, already subject to suspicion and some contention, would be underrepresented in the Centennial Exhibition's American School, and we will get back to them shortly. So returning to the selection committee, civic rivalry was apparent from the start. Dealing with New York's art community was one of Sartain's greatest challenges. He was a prolific letter writer, and it's fascinating to read them. New Yorkers were still a little sore about the great event not taking place in New York, and they already had a strong sense of their city as a national center. So any Philadelphian named chief of the art exhibition would have been disdained. And as a practitioner of the so-called minor art of engraving, Sartain's appointment was greeted with, let's say, skepticism. From late March on, the selection committee met for selection in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The selection process was organized by city for the convenience of those submitting, but as a result, each session became a referendum on its overall art scene and its place in the proposed national narrative. Since the New York jurors were mostly landscapists, it was no surprise that their contribution was dominated by landscapes. And Sartain did not place himself on the committee of selection, as you saw, and he claimed not to have seen any of the works the committee rejected, only those they approved. So he probably did not participate in the selection. However, he regularly circumvented the committee, and I'm just giving you one of many examples. This is Albert Bierstadt's California Spring. So just one example is Albert Bierstadt's submission. Sartain had assured his friend of all the space he wished. I think he offered him 54 linear feet, if you can imagine that. And Bierstadt did not send any works to the selection committee. He expected instead that the group would come to him in his studio. And many New York artists had low regard for Bierstadt's aggressive promotional methods. One of his landscape colleagues, Jervis McEntee, fumed, "Bierstadt has had fair warning that his pictures will not be examined at his rooms," and defies the committee, who are resolved to oppose his presumption to the bitter end. But Bierstadt sent his paintings directly to Philadelphia, no doubt with Sartain's intervention and to the consternation of McEntee and his colleagues. And this is a lovely drawing of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, the plan in progress. And by the time the committee convened in Philadelphia, the members were exhausted and animosities were high. McEntee called the committee's 2 days in Boston and its 2 days in New York the most fatiguing work I ever did. At this time, the Philadelphia committee members' attention was not focused on the exhibition in Fairmount Park. The centennial year marked the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts' first exhibition in 6 years, timed to coincide with the opening of its new building. The Academy's exhibition was originally scheduled to close well before the May 10 opening of the Centennial Exhibition. Sartain intended for the contents of the Pennsylvania Academy exhibition to be simply transferred in its entirety to Memorial Hall after its close at the Academy and before the selection committee arrived in Philadelphia. However, delays in the building's completion pushed the close of the Pennsylvania Academy's exhibition to June 3rd, nearly a month after the Centennial Exhibition's opening. The Academy works were examined by the committee after all, in spite of Sartain's maneuvering, and they rejected almost all of them. That the Pennsylvania Academy's paintings and sculpture were deemed unworthy was an affront to Philadelphian taste by a New York-dominated jury and an insult that Sartain would not forget. And this needs no introduction. Conflicts were bound to erupt among men of widely different perspectives from proudly distinct cities. They were built on local oppositions, but they also reveal much larger concerns about international rivalries. The best-known controversy is the committee's rejection of Thomas Eakins' The Gross Clinic. Sartain knew Eakins well as a lifelong friend of his son William, and he wrote in December of 1874, "Tom Eakins is making excellent progress with his large picture of Dr. Gross, and it bids fair to be a capital work." Eakins' official application to the exhibition bears the note, "Not enough space," a bland and inoffensive reason for excluding a controversial painting. Scholars have suggested that it was rejected by the conservative New Yorkers. Other theories range from the sickening blood on Gross's hands to simple professional jealousy. As it happened, the United States government wished to show portraits of prominent men in all departments, so Eakins' painting was displayed in the United States Army Post Hospital by late May, well after the exhibition opened, probably due to the efforts of Dr. Gross himself. The rejection of Eakins' masterpiece was yet another insult to Sartain and his Philadelphia colleagues. But there was more to come in the rejection of another painting by Harry Humphrey Moore. And on the left, you see a drawing of it taken from a magazine. On the right is a finished painting of Moore's, just to give you a better idea of what his work looks like. Moore was born into a wealthy New York family and was deaf from age 3. In the early 1860s, he studied in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts with Thomas Eakins. The two became close friends and trained side by side in the Paris atelier of Jean-Léon Gérôme. The Philadelphia Evening Bulletin reported that 2 large American pictures entitled Admission to the Exhibition were rejected by the committee for reasons which had nothing to do with the artistic merit of the works themselves. And these were the Gross Clinic and Moore's painting on the left, Almay, A Dream of Alhambra. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1881. A wood engraving from Frank Leslie's popular monthly shows Moore's masterpiece on the back wall of his studio, and what you see there is a detail of that woodcut. It depicts a scantily clad woman performing a sensual dance in an exotic setting. The painting not only demonstrates the vogue for Near Eastern subjects, but it also shows the technical mastery that the artist learned during his extensive training abroad. The New York Times reported that the work was rejected for indecency, though it was a similar subject to those of European artists that American collectors were pursuing at that time. The paired rejections of Almay and the Gross Clinic crystallized civic rivalry along the lines of the debate over internationalism. Both pictures are figure subjects that carried the whiff of Paris. Both works were products of study abroad under the same master, though Akins applied his training to an American subject and Moore to one that was popular in Europe. The rejection of most of the Pennsylvania Academy's paintings and sculpture was an insult to Philadelphia artists, and Sartain must have been further offended by the refusal of the Gross Clinic. The rejection of Almay was the final straw. After months of frustrations with New Yorkers and then this barrage of insults, Sartain responded by surreptitiously transferring Almay and 7 other rejected works from the Pennsylvania Academy into the American Art Exhibition in Fairmount Park. And I like to think of it happening in the middle of the night. It was widely reported in newspapers and loudly decried by the New York members of the selection committee. In the end, the selection committee selected about 850 paintings and sculptures for the United States Art Exhibition. And compared to today, 200 paintings would be a very substantial number of works for an exhibition. The overwhelming quantity of works in the United States exhibition created serious problems. First and foremost, where and how they would be displayed in a limited space. And in case you can't read that, the caption is "a flanking movement" on the hanging committee. So this concern was complicated by period practice of hanging paintings nearly from floor to ceiling. Some privileged works would be placed on the line at eye level, where they were easily seen. The rest would be hung at higher and higher levels until the paintings near the ceiling, those that had been skied, as they called it, were barely discernible at all. And as a result, visitors and critics naturally focused on the more prominently displayed works. In the face of such profusion, the hanging of the paintings would be very important in determining which were seen, remembered, and entered into the canon of American art. Sartain formed a committee on arrangement toward this end, and this group proved just as contentious and fraught with civic and ideological rivalries as the selection committee. Sartain began thinking about the arrangement of the exhibition as early as November of 1875, when he wrote to a friend, an artist friend, James Smiley, "One of the duties of my own office is the allotment of space, which it would seem includes the individual location." And he later continued that it was his plan to appoint as my assistants in the arrangement the presidents of the major artist organizations of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. And if this sounds like a mere formality, it is because that is exactly how Sartain saw it. And this committee comprised 7 members. 4 came from Philadelphia, 2 from New York, and 1 from Boston. World's Fair planners always experienced a mad rush of preparation in the last few weeks, and most exhibitions up to this point and after had opened either late or incomplete. Sartain originally planned to take the entire month of April to arrange the works, but as a result of delays in finishing both Memorial Hall and the Art Annex, works arriving late in Philadelphia, and the selection committee's difficulty finishing its task, the arrangement took place in just a few frenzied weeks before the May 10 opening. Construction of the Art Annex was not complete until a month after the opening, so the hanging of those galleries was further delayed. And here's Sartain again, and Worthington Whitridge, a New York landscape painter and president of the National Academy of Design. So Smiley was appointed a member of the hanging committee, and luckily he kept a diary, which records a remarkably contentious few weeks. He arrived with New York landscape painter Worthington Whitridge in Philadelphia on April 24. The very next day, he noted that the antagonism of Whitridge and Sartain is very apparent. By May 2, he reported that Whitridge and Sartain are by the ears and quarrel all the time, probably because Sartain tried to place the work of Whitridge and several of his compatriots in an obscure part of Memorial Hall so that he could have room to place the work of expatriate artists. Smiley wrote that on May 5th, Sartain had put Whitridge out of Memorial Hall practically, and things had reached such a crisis that something had to be done. And I wish I knew exactly what had been done. Apparently some compromise was reached. But it is remarkable that art world leaders in 1876 considered the Centennial Exhibition so important that its installation merited such an altercation. And after all this controversy, the installation was far from complete for the May 10 opening. This was due in part to the late arrival of the works of Americans in Europe, which didn't arrive in port until May 13, 3 days after the opening, and then it took weeks to unload the works and transfer them to Fairmount Park. So it's hard to imagine that expatriate works could be given their due when they had to be wedged into leftover spaces in the display. Most of the millions of people streaming into Fairmount Park knew little about art or curatorial practice. They would take the exhibition at face value as an accurate accounting of the country's past and present. They might not realize what most modern museum goers understand. The curator has a point of view and selects objects from a universe of possibilities that advance that point of view. But in 1876, a great deal of power lay in the implicit trust between the organizers of the exhibition and the average visitor. So now we're going to look at what they saw, the results of that very intense planning process. The United States contribution was divided into 3 sections: American art of the past, American art of the present day, and foreign works owned by United States collectors. So tonight we will touch very briefly on the retrospective and spend most of our time on the contemporary art of the period. This is the floor plan of Memorial Hall, and the galleries we're going to be focusing on are outlined there in red. The United States display of paintings and sculpture occupied several galleries in Memorial Hall and the Art Annex. Floor plans of the buildings informed visitors which spaces were designated for each country. In the privileged space of Memorial Hall, 2 prominent central galleries were used to showcase the most esteemed works of the American school. One was the long, narrow space on top that's designated US and known as the Central Gallery West. And this is a photograph of that. So more a throughway than a destination, it was a long, narrow corridor. And this photograph of the gallery shows a space that seems confined even with no one present. And unfortunately, it's the only known image, and even more unfortunately, it's taken at a rather sharp angle that offers an excellent view of the picture's frames, but the paintings themselves are hard to identify. But we do know, luckily, which ones were present there, and you see a sample here on the left are Copley, Mrs. Thomas Boylston, Washington Alston's Rosalie. At the top right, Jasper Francis Cropsey's The Old Mill, and at the bottom right, Sanford Gifford's Lake Geneva. So we do know that the Central Gallery West included most of the retrospective of American Old Masters, highlighting works by Copley, Stewart, and Alston. In addition to early American paintings, the Central Gallery West included a large body of contemporary works by New Yorkers. Hudson River School artists, such as the 2 you see here, also Asher B. Durand, John Frederick Kensett, and others were abundantly represented. So numerically, in this gallery, New York artists were preeminent with 84 out of 141 works, in contrast to just 12 from Philadelphia and just 3 from Boston. And this is a view of Gallery C, the lower highlighted gallery that you saw. The United States' most prominent space in Memorial Hall was this expansive gallery. Gallery C was more than twice as large as the cramped space of the Central Gallery West, so visitors could step back to take in larger works, and benches allowed them the opportunity for prolonged contemplation. Sartain's purpose for this space was to showcase the nation's most highly esteemed artists, and these are the south and east walls. And a few examples of things that were in that gallery: Charles Sprague Pierce's L'Italienne, from left to right, Frederick Bridgman's Flower of the Harem, and then below on the right, Toby Rosenthal's Elaine. So Gallery C, as you can see here, included many more works by emerging young American painters and more than twice the number of paintings by artists from Boston and Philadelphia, cities which tended to support expatriate artists rather than the opposite in the Central Gallery West. Gallery C also displayed a strong representation of artists who had either trained abroad or still resided in Europe. So now we see the galleries side by side. Some conclusions can be drawn from which paintings and sculptures were selected for these important spaces. The narrow, confined Central Gallery West included 28 works by artists of the past, that is, deceased artists, suggesting that this gallery represented the historical canon. By contrast, the more expansive Gallery C included only 12 works by deceased artists, and of those, most were recently deceased, such as, for trivia buffs, John Frederick Kensett, Emanuel Leutze, Thomas Sully, and J.E. Sudam. While the Central Gallery West represented the nation's history, Gallery C was dominated by artists of the present day. So it seems that Sartain cleverly linked the New York landscapists in the Central Gallery West to the past and the European-influenced figure painters to the present. In this way, the Hudson River School artists could not inherit the mantle of history. They already were history. The two galleries subtly conveyed the message that the time of the New York Landscape School had passed and the expatriates' time had come. And this is a floor plan of the annex that was behind Memorial Hall. The contested United States spaces in Memorial Hall were intended to create a unified national American school. But in the art annex, civic identity was openly acknowledged, and most galleries were hung by city. And just a few highlights: Gallery 30 included paintings by Philadelphia luminaries, such as Peter Rothermel and Christian Schussler. If you can't see, let's see, it's right there. Along with works from painters residing in Paris, Rome, and Munich, again, connecting those cities to expatriate artists. Gallery 40 included your very own Xantha Smith's painting, The Kearsarge and the Alabama, which I had the great pleasure of seeing tonight. Gallery 42 became infamous for housing the works that Sartain smuggled in from the Pennsylvania Academy, in particular, H.H. Moore's Almay, A Dream of Alhambra. But we haven't talked yet about the largest controversy in the United States galleries, Peter Rothermel's Battle of Gettysburg. The Centennial Exhibition was conceived as an opportunity to heal the wounds of the Civil War and reunite North and South. So Civil War subjects were officially prohibited, but there were pointed references to the Civil War in prominent galleries. A place of honor was reserved in Memorial Hall for Thomas Hicks' portrait of Union General George G. Meade, a hero of Gettysburg and Philadelphia's foremost soldier, and it's wonderful to be in the Meade Room tonight. And it is not surprising that an exhibition in Philadelphia, in spite of the ban on Civil War subjects, supposedly, would pay tribute to its greatest military leader. The Confederate Army was represented as well by a nearly full-length portrait of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. In this way, the two generals who met at Gettysburg were reunited at the Centennial Exhibition in the same gallery, and the political implications were greatly heightened by the presence of the exhibition's biggest and most inflammatory painting. The largest American painting ever created, Rothermel's Battle of Gettysburg, measures over 31 feet wide, and it would have dominated an entire wall of the gallery. The painting depicted a day that was remembered as the turning point not only of the battle, but of the entire war. It conflates incidents that took place at different points during the day and conveys the chaos and confusion of war, with waves of soldiers clashing in the middle of the canvas and savage fighting stretching out into the distance. The Battle of Gettysburg ignited a firestorm of condemnation, and the most vehement objections were not to its merit as an artwork, of course, but rather to the appropriateness of its subject at a national festival of reunion. And here we see a cartoon of the period titled, with veterans of two armies, and the caption says, "Fighting the battle over again," in front of the painting. So each has lost a leg in the fighting, but their shared tragedy does not unite them, and their animosity remains fierce, belying hopes of union in the centennial year. So now we move through the galleries to take a quick peek at the foreign exhibitions. It was hoped that the highly anticipated foreign art contributions would comprise didactic museum-quality exhibitions, and that the contributing nations would send works representing their own national histories of art and the best works of the present day to educate visitors, as the United States had tried to do. However, most participating countries sent something akin to a gallery show of works of art for purchase, with some of middling quality at best, perhaps sent in hopes of sales to undiscriminating Americans. The foreign exhibitions were soon perceived as a test of, rather than a lesson for, developing American taste. At a moment when Americans were amassing huge fortunes and attempting to translate their wealth into social standing, involvement with the arts, and European art in particular, became a means of entry into high society. In the 1870s, Americans purchased the work of French academic painters, and you see two examples here, Jean-Léon Gérôme's Paulus Verso on the left, and William Adolphe Bouguereau's Charity on the right. Newly rich Americans were repeatedly warned of the dangers of fraud, and worse yet, embarrassment, at the hands of unscrupulous European dealers. In the past, some had offered Americans dubious old master, in quotes, paintings, perhaps because they could make a sale without sacrificing a better quality or more securely attributed piece that could be saved for a more discriminating purchaser. The writer James Jackson Jarvis warned that the responsible party of art frauds is less the doer, who caters to the taste of pseudo-patrons, than the buyer, whose guileless ignorance and pretentious taste creates the demand for false work. So the transaction thus became a test in which the buyer had to demonstrate his or her sophistication. And this is just a quick look at the Austrian gallery in Memorial Hall. The foreign exhibitions in Fairmount Park brought these questions to the fore. Each nation organized its own commission and controlled the selection and hanging of its contribution. Substantial displays ranging from 150 to 500 works were sent from Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. A total of over 540 sculptures and 1,891 paintings provided an overwhelming range of comparisons to the approximately 850 American paintings and sculptures on view. The largest contributions of foreign art came from Great Britain, France, and Italy. The most admired contribution was by far that of Great Britain, which occupied one of the large central spaces. And here you see two paintings from that gallery. On the left is J.M.W. Turner's Dolbaden Castle, and on the right is Joshua Reynolds' self-portrait. The British Commission sent 193 paintings and 15 sculptures, many of them distinguished works from the Royal Collection, the Royal Academy, including these two, and a number of them came from prominent private collections. Only Britain sent the kind of display that Americans desired, one that offered some of the great historical works familiar to art lovers and provided newcomers with a proper education in the country's national characteristics. Contemporary French painting, as I mentioned, was in vogue with American collectors. American audiences had great expectations of the French exhibition, and so it was with great disappointment that Americans greeted a contribution that was large, with 301 paintings and 74 sculptures, and there's a view of the gallery here, but far from representative, lacking works by its greatest names. Critic Earl Shin produced a long and doleful list of omissions, and I'm going to go through them all quickly to give you a full sense of his complaint. He says, "It is painful to pass the French rooms, deprived of all the classical names, without a single example of Ingres, Millet, Rousseau, Gérôme, Baudry, Flandrin, Delaroche, Ibert, Meissonier, Corot, d'Aubigny, Père, Couture, Reynaud, Bonnat, without even the new and rising names, such as Delaunay, Moreau, Vallon, and Laurens." Critics called it an admirable presentation of the mediocrity of French art. People quickly recognized that, given the growing American market for contemporary French art, many of these maligned pictures were sent to sell, perhaps in an attempt to palm off substandard works to credulous Yankees. If the foreign contributions to the Centennial Exhibition amounted to tests of culture and sophistication for the American public, then the Italian display was the final exam. More than any other display, the Italian contribution was most obviously geared towards sales to an American audience. It was thronged, as you can see here, with 334 sculptures, many of which were widely recognized as decorative work by stonecutters rather than the original conceptions of sculptors. Critics called the exhibition empty of art, and the marbles were not, of course, sculpture. Rather, they were high-end souvenirs that constituted a key part of the luxury goods market in Italy. The Italian sculptures were mostly either precious children or risque female figures characterized as boudoir art. And here's a cartoon of the period. Samantha in the art gallery looks like the Italian gallery. In spite of, or because of, a long-standing American squeamishness with the unclothed figure in art, the forest of lasciviously posed nudes made the Italian exhibition undeniably popular. And as you can see, it became fodder for humorists. One critic complained that the Italian statues were sent over here to sell and were cut down to the level of American understanding in an insulting manner. If the Centennial Exhibition was an instrument of education, this was an example of what not to aspire to. But it appears that Americans behaved creditably by not purchasing inferior foreign works in great numbers. While exact sales records have not been located for each country, Sartain reported that more artworks were sold than expected, but he was careful to note the quality of the works purchased, assuring readers that among them were the best foreign canvases and statues. And I did find numbers in the case of the French contribution. Out of 375 objects, only 12 paintings and 2 sculptures were sold. So the American collector's response, or rather the lack of it, was considered a triumph of discerning American taste. The New York Daily Tribune explained that it should be written down to our credit, not that our merchant princes have had the money to buy any pictures offered in the European markets, but that they have so soon learned what to buy. So we can conclude our tour through Memorial Hall by asking, what was the impact of the combined art exhibitions in Memorial Hall? As planned, the Pennsylvania Museum opened in Memorial Hall after the Centennial Exhibition closed, and you see a few images of it here. And you probably know that it evolved into the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is as wonderful a legacy as the organizers in 1876 could hope for. And Memorial Hall, you probably also know, remains today as the home of the Please Touch Museum. And we'll close with a view of opening day. While the Philadelphia Museum of Art developed over many decades, the Centennial Exhibition had a more immediate impact farther afield. Though the exact geographic origins of Centennial Exhibition visitors cannot be known, it seems likely that most arriving from beyond the East Coast hailed from the Midwest, since travel from the far west would be prohibitive and Southern attendance was unfortunately very low. Among the buildings on the fairgrounds sponsored by individual states were those of Kansas, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Missouri, suggesting that the citizens of those states had a particular interest. The Centennial Exhibition has been acknowledged for helping to launch the era of museum expansion. We know that the MFA and the Met and the Corcoran were all founded during this time. However, its impact reached far beyond the East Coast. During the decade after the Centennial Exhibition, a remarkable number of art institutions were founded in the Midwest. The sudden and swift dissemination of museum ideals into the nation's interior was a crucial step forward in the country's cultural progress, one that could have only been inspired by a collective event of national significance. And of course, the Great Fair was acclaimed as a turning point in American art. When the exhibition closed, Scribner's Monthly reflected that we look forward upon the next quarter of a century to the only general movement in art that our young country has ever known. We are ready for it, and stimulus and direction have come just when we needed it. A few years later, the Penn Monthly declared that with the opening of the Centennial Exhibition were unfolded possibilities of culture and refinement for the people never before thought of. And he further asserted that the era of national culture in the United States may be dated from the Centennial. Thank you.
Does anybody have a question for Dr. Orcutt? All right, here we go.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
This is more of a comment and kind of a question. I'm thinking of the Great Central Fair held in Philadelphia in June of 1864, where it had that art exhibit, that gallery. One of the galleries reminded me of photos of that. But that was driven, I think, more by the collectors, like Lawrence Claghorn, a Union League member, and others who had extensive collections. Rather, it seems like the Centennial was really coming from a different angle, that it was artists' contributions. So I just wondering, a lot of the organizers of the Centennial were in Philadelphia were the same. So I was wondering if they were building upon that early experience or how that morphed. It's just your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because the Sanitary Fair, both the Great Central Fair here in Philadelphia and the Metropolitan Fair in New York and many others, provided artists and collectors the opportunity to get some experience organizing. But in some ways, they couldn't use that experience in the same way for the Centennial. The sanitary fairs were fundraising events. They were very much collector-driven, just bringing together all the great works we have. And there was not necessarily the kind of organizing principle that they were trying to observe at the Centennial, which makes things exponentially more difficult when you're trying to put together a national school and convey some kind of message, and the stakes are entirely different. So I think in a funny way, it both helped and fed into the experiences that led to the Centennial, but it also threw up some interesting challenges that they had to overcome to realize what a different kind of project it was.
Okay, anybody else?
Hi, I didn't realize that the Centennial Exhibition involved sales for some of the international rooms. So I'm curious if that was also a factor for American artists, or if that was really just for the international works.
Yeah, I know I'm probably maligning the foreign exhibitions a little too much, but of course, American artists wanted to sell their work, and Jervis McEntee, someone I mentioned, was saying, gosh, it'd be nice if I sold some works. But in the American exhibition, I think a very small fraction of them were for sale, like maybe 100 out of 800. And so you get the sense that this was meant as a didactic exhibition, as a statement of what American art is and has been, where the foreign contributions tended to be, except for Great Britain, almost entirely for sale. And so it is a question of one extreme or the other, but American artists certainly did want and need to sell their work. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. That's a good question.
Anybody? Then I've got one, if I may. Oops. Is there a question? No, I doubt that. Give it a shot.
All questions welcome.
Hi, you talked about Zane Smith's painting here. What others do we have in our collection here that may have been there?
Oh, gosh, I didn't know of any others. That was the one that I knew was at the Union League. I had a wonderful tour from Jim, and I'm sorry to say nothing else jumped out at me, but if you have, if you want to send me a list or a catalog or something, I would be more than happy to compare it to my list, and maybe we will uncover some more, because you know, when you're trying to identify works that were in a historic exhibition, you never get anywhere near finding them all. You know, it's 850, and many of them are lost to history. So it becomes a long-term detective project, and it's really exciting when you find something. So I was thrilled to find the Xantha Smith, and I hope to find more.
Right, actually, kind of using that as a segue, given your comment earlier about how the New Yorkers were upset that Philadelphians were controlling the hanging and everything like that, so what really was the position of Philadelphia art and artist relative to the rest of the country at that time? Was it, because at one point in time, Philadelphia, in the second half of the 18th, maybe early 19th centuries, was really the most important city in the country in terms of culture, society, art, architecture, and things like that. So where was Philadelphia by the time of the Centennial? Was it still up there?
I certainly think so. And I found I went to school in New York. I lived in New York for many years, so you tend to get immersed in that story. But in working on this project, I was very interested to find out that Philadelphia during this period is a very cosmopolitan city and is very interested in supporting the new, supporting going abroad, learning about great European works, great European techniques. And not to say that wasn't happening in New York, but I think the difference with Philadelphia is you have establishment leadership in the art world who support that, as opposed to in New York where you had younger artists who had to really push their way in to get any recognition.
Great, thanks. All right, anybody wants to take a stab? Just one little comment then, if I may, then. Before the Centennial and the opening of the Pennsylvania Academy building in 1876, there really was no public art exhibit space in the city. So in 1870, 71, and 73, the Union League held 3 art exhibits to which the public was invited, as well as the membership itself. So if you can imagine the Broad Street building, as small as it looks today, but if you look at it, it's really got a lot of wall space. So that was where these wonderful exhibits took place, featuring Philadelphia artists, Pennsylvania artists, and the collections of the members themselves. So it was kind of a precursor to what was going to happen at the Centennial, except maybe without the infighting about who got what hung and where, that type of thing. But nonetheless, though, so it's a neat part of League history and its involvement in the art world in Philadelphia in the 19th century. So, and I can tell you're all bored beyond belief at that one. So, all right. Okay, like, did I really need to know that much history about Philadelphia? Like, okay, no. Anyway, so anybody else? No. Well, then, first off, I have read the book, almost all of it. I highly recommend it because it's a wonderful window into Philadelphia in the 19th century. And there are many, many League members mentioned in here as well. We mentioned Clyghorn and Rotherham L. Waugh, and others. So, and I'm sure that Dr. Orcutt will be in the back and happy to sign books for anybody who wants to buy one, if you would, please. And so other than that, I just want to say thank you all for coming out tonight. We really do appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you again.